Reading with your kids.
Hola, ni hao, konnichiwa, assalamu alaikum, shalom, mahaba, moni moli wanji, namaste, jambo, bienvenidos. Hi, my name is Jedley, and this is the Reading with Your Kids podcast. We are coming to you from the beautiful neighborhood of Reedville in the southwest corner of Boston, Massachusetts. We are so grateful and honored that you're joining us in our missions to help families grow closer through reading and to give parents the tools they need to help their kids grow up to know that everyone deserves to be loved, respected, and included. Our guest today is Richard Capriola. He is the author of The Addicted Child, A Parent's Guide to Adolescent Substance Abuse. Hey, Richard, welcome to the Reading with Your Kids podcast.
Thank you, Jed. It's a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me about this topic of adolescent substance abuse.
You know, I wish I could say it's a pleasure to talk to you about this. It's not, but it's important. This is such an important issue. Can you give us an idea, just to start with, how many kids are affected by substance abuse?
Well, many teenagers, for example, I would say the large majority of them get exposed to alcohol and marijuana. Mm-hmm. Those are still the two most popular drugs. The estimates vary from 20 to 40% of high school students might be using alcohol or marijuana. But what we've noticed in the last few years that is rather alarming is a dramatic increase in what is known as vaping, where they will take a substance like nicotine or marijuana, they'll use an instrument that turns it into a vapor, and then they will inhale it. Well, in the last 3 years, the percentage of high school students that have turned to vaping nicotine and marijuana has just dramatically increased. And I think that's something parents just need to be aware of, that this vaping epidemic that's out there, this turning to vaping as a way that kids get marijuana and nicotine, is really increasing at a dramatic rate.
Yeah. Now, our attitudes about marijuana have certainly changed. It's recreational use is legal here in Massachusetts and in many other states. Medical use is permitted. I don't know, it's certainly not on a federal level, but in many states. But it's still, even if you are comfortable with it being used recreationally by adults, it's different with kids who are using it. Tell us why you're real concerned about kids using marijuana.
It is very different for adolescents than it is for adults. And the primary reason is brain development. Adult brains, after age 24, 25, our brains become mature, fully developed around age 24, 25. Adolescent brains, however, are in the process of developing, forming those integral, important circuits that are going to be so important for that child when they enter into adulthood. So the big difference is brain development. When you look at marijuana, there's a big difference between using marijuana as an adult with a fully developed brain and using it as an adolescent, where the brain is very vulnerable to being damaged and impaired because it's in the process of developing. The example that I can give you is I worked with many kids at Menninger Clinic who were smoking marijuana. And when the psychological and the neuropsychological test results came back on these kids, what I noticed was that the processing speed of their brain was below average. Their short-term memory was impaired, and their motivation was below average. Now, some of these changes, like the processing speed of the brain and the short-term memory deficits, might not be readily observable. You might not notice that those are going on without some type of in-depth assessment. But these are just examples of how the adolescent brain, which is in the process of maturing and developing, becomes more vulnerable to damage by using a substance, whereas the adult brain still can have some changes as a result of the marijuana use or any drug use. But the adolescent brain is particularly vulnerable because it's in the process of developing and maturing.
Yeah. Now, are those changes or damage, is this permanent, or is it something? You hear the stereotype of the stoner who's lack of motivation and kind of. Is this just something that you notice when a kid is using the substance, or is it something that's going to be staying with the kid long term?
Well, it depends. It depends on how young a person is when they start using a substance. It depends on how long they use a substance, and it depends on the substance itself. Some illicit drugs are more dangerous than others. But regardless of that, we do know that our brains have a remarkable capacity to heal themselves. Mm-hmm. So once a person stops using a substance, the brain goes into recovery and it starts to improve. And over a period of time, we can see some pretty remarkable improvements in the brain. And I think that's the message to parents, that regardless of the substance being used, once a child enters treatment and they stop using a substance, the brain has a remarkable capacity to heal itself, and recovery is very possible.
Yeah. One of the things I've heard too is that a lot of, even in places where marijuana use has been legalized or decriminalized, it's not available for kids. Kids can't walk into a dispensary and buy it. So kids are still relying on illicit drugs, on street level drugs. And I'm hearing that there's a lot more that's found in these in street drugs, that in fact some marijuana is tainted. I'm not sure if that's a word, with things like fentanyl.
You're absolutely right, and that's the difference between obtaining a drug like marijuana from a legal dispensary, where you can be pretty well assured that it's not tainted with some type of chemical or some other ingredient that might be harmful for you. But kids can't legally purchase and can't legally possess marijuana, even in states where it's legal for adults. So they're more likely to get their substances off of the street from dealers. And the frightening thing is, these kids know that these drugs are readily available. When we ask them, for example, high school seniors, how easy is it for you to get marijuana? 80% of them tell us it's not a problem. If they want it, they know where to get it. 30% of them will tell us that getting a drug like LSD is no problem. They can get it if they want it. So these kids know that these drugs are readily available if they want it. The other thing is, they don't see these drugs as harmful. When we ask them, how harmful is it for you to smoke marijuana almost every day, a very low percentage of kids tell us they think that's harmful. So when you add the fact that these drugs are readily available, kids know where to get them if they want them, and their perception of risk is very low, that creates the environment where we are. And what we've noticed is as these kids go through the grades from freshman to sophomore to junior to senior, their perception of how risky these drugs are declines, so that a senior looks at these drugs as less risky than, say, a freshman will. So as they go through the grades, they begin to see these drugs as less and less risky.
Mm-hmm. Tell me, one of the things that has occurred over the last few decades is the number of kids being treated for things like ADHD and other kind of learning difficulties with some very, very powerful psychotropic drugs. That's really increased. Are these kids at more of a risk of developing a substance abuse problem, or are they more at a risk of being injured by these different illegal drugs?
They're more at risk of turning to an illicit drug if they're not treated. Many of the kids that I worked with who were smoking marijuana, often multiple times a day, when I asked them to help me understand why they were smoking so much marijuana, the number one answer that came back was, it helps me with my anxiety. So for some kids, not all kids, but for some kids, there's an underlying psychological issue that the child is using a drug like marijuana to medicate. And that's why it's so important to get a comprehensive assessment of your child, not just on the drugs, but a comprehensive assessment where you can rule in or rule out whether or not any of these other mental health issues might be present, that your child could potentially be using a drug like marijuana or any other drug to medicate. So the risk of a child turning to a substance, if they have one of these underlying issues, can be pretty high. And until that child gets appropriate treatment for, say, anxiety or depression or trauma, they may very well at some point discover that there's a drug out there that helps them with those intense feelings that they don't like having.
Yeah. What other kind of issues might kids be self-medicating?
They might be medicating for, in addition to anxiety, it might be depression, it might be trauma, perhaps being bullied at school that the parents might not know about. It's basically any type of intolerable thought, intolerable feeling, or intolerable emotion. Kids are no different than adults. We don't like having an intolerable thought. We don't like having an intolerable emotion like anxiety or depression. We don't like having an intolerable memory. And when we have them, we don't just naturally sit around and sit with it. We do something to get rid of it. And that's the same thing with kids. They will also seek some type of relief for any intolerable thought or feeling or memory that they have. And unfortunately, in some cases, that relief comes in the form of a substance that they find on the street, like marijuana.
As I'm sitting here, I'm having this thought, we, as parents, we want our kids to be healthy. We want to make sure that they're living a healthy lifestyle. And so we'll take them to the doctor, where doctors are able to run tests and discover things that, the kids may not have known was bothering them. They do blood tests and find out, oh, this kid might be anemic or whatever. Are there any kind of screenings that families can turn to that might help them identify that this kid who looks like he or she is pretty successful and happy on the outside may be suffering on the inside?
Well, I would leave that type of an assessment to the professionals, the ones who are trained to know what tests to administer and are trained to interpret those tests and determine for you whether or not there's an appropriate diagnosis based on the discussions they have with the child and the assessments and the tests that they give. I have a chapter in my book which is on assessments, and it guides parents into knowing which type of assessment should you get done. But I would leave the actual assessments and the testing and the interpretation of the results to the professionals. Oh,
yes, of course. I would never try to give my kids a blood test or anything like that. I was just curious if, because there's so many kids that we hear, parents are surprised when they find out that their kid who was getting all A's and was excelling in ballet or whatever, and then all of a sudden they find out, oh, gee, this kid's been using substances for a while now. I had no idea.
Yeah. I think that's an important point because this is a subject that many parents want to avoid. They don't want to think about it. They don't want to deal with it. They don't think it can happen to their kid. But my point is that there is no child that's totally protected from exposure to alcohol or drugs. There are protective environments, but no child is totally protected. It doesn't matter where you live, urban, suburban, rural. It doesn't matter what your level of income is. It doesn't matter what church you go to. It doesn't matter what school you send your child to. all children are vulnerable to being captured up by alcohol or drugs. I sat across from many families at Menninger Clinic, and I went through their child's history of using a substance, what drugs they were using, how young they were when they started, how often they were using. And I would, I would give them a diagnosis of a substance use disorder. And when I finished, they oftentimes would look across at me and they would say, I had no idea this was going on. Or if they did suspect their child was using a substance, they might say, I sort of knew something was going on, but I didn't know it was this bad. And these were good parents. These were very good parents doing the best job that they could do. They missed the warning signs because nobody told them what to look for. So they didn't know what the warning signs were. And then they get caught with the surprise that their child has been using marijuana or drinking alcohol or using some other substance. They didn't know what the warning signs were.
So let's tell the families listening what those warning signs are.
Well, in my book, I have warning signs for alcohol use. I have warning signs for marijuana use. I have warning signs for a child that might be self-harming themselves. I have warning signs for a child that might be developing an eating disorder. Because sometimes, not always, but sometimes self-injury and eating disorders will accompany a child's using a substance. They're doing both. What I usually recommend to parents is pay attention to the changes that you see in your child. You know your child better than anyone, so pay attention to the changes that you see. Don't assume that the changes you're seeing are just adolescent, normal acting out behaviors. They may very well be that, but they may also be an indication that there's something under the surface that you need to be aware of that's going on. Some examples would be a child whose grades are starting to decline, a child who gets into disciplinary problems at school, a child who used to participate in sports no longer enjoys or wants to participate in sports. A child who openly introduced you to their friends. You knew who their friends were. You might have even known who their family members were. Now becomes very secretive of who their friends are. So pay attention to those changes. If they come and go pretty quickly, it's probably not too concerning. But if they tend to linger on, and then you notice more and more of these changes, then I think it's time to be concerned and get some assessments done so that you can rule in or rule out what issues are really going on with your child.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so very important. One of the things that we've said here on the Reading with Your Kids podcast is that, if you want to start, you're going to have that conversation about drugs and alcohol with your kids when they're teenagers. And the best time to start those conversations are when they're on your lap at 5 and 4 years old, not necessarily talking about drugs and alcohol, but just talking. Having conversations, reading a book together, asking the child what they think about the book, what their opinion is, empowering the kids, letting them know that we respect their opinions. We want to know what's going on in their lives. That those conversations we have with our 3, 4, 5-year-olds can be the foundation of a lifelong conversation. Am I crazy in giving that advice to folks?
No, you're absolutely right. I think when you have pre-teenagers, even 5, 6, 7 years old, that there are things you can do to start to build on that relationship of open communication and trust. Reading to our children is so very important. Use that opportunity to read to your children, to get their input, to get their reaction to what you're reading and what they're listening to. Start to develop that good, solid communication foundation. And when it comes to communicating with your child, it's important, I think, to understand that we're pretty good at listening to each other's words, but we're not so good sometimes at listening to the feelings behind those words. And that's a skill that every parent can learn and every parent can practice, so that when we're listening to our children, we're not just hearing their words, we're hearing the feelings behind those words, and we reflect those back to the child to sort of check to make sure that what we're hearing is correct. So parents can go a long way towards developing that communication with their child, so that they're listening and tuning into their child's feelings. What are the feelings behind what they're saying? And it's easy to practice. It's as simple as saying, I'm hear you saying this. I hear you feeling this. Am I correct? And getting feedback from the child so that the communication goes both ways. As the child gets older, say in the early preteen ages, I think parents can begin to lay the foundation for keeping those children away from substances as they get into the teenage years. And by that, I mean, if a child is in the preteen ages, say 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 years old, start to talk to them about the brain. Kids are very curious. They want to learn. They want information. Start to talk to them about the brain. Educate them about the neuroscience of the brain. You don't have to become an expert on it. Mm-hmm. Just learn the basics that this is what the brain does. You have an area of the brain that helps you talk. You have an area of the brain that helps you walk. You have an area of the brain that helps you think. You have an area of the brain that helps you move. Help them understand what the brain does, how the brain develops, the importance of protecting that brain. That you can do in the very early ages, pre-elementary school. And then as the child enters the teenage years, you've already helped them understand the importance of the brain. Now you can start to introduce, let's take a look at how drugs affect the brain. You understand how the brain works. You understand how it's growing and developing, and you need to protect it. You understand what the different areas of the brain do. Now let's take a look at what drugs do to the brain. Mm-hmm. And I think that can be very powerful, because with the teenagers that I worked with, it didn't do me any good to tell them drugs were illegal. It didn't do me any good to tell them drugs were bad. Mm-hmm. It didn't do me any good to tell them if they continue to use, they might drop out of school, not get a job, not go to college. They didn't believe any of that. But what did capture their attention, what they were really tuning into, was when I talked to them about the neuroscience of their brain and how drugs affect the brain. That they were interested in. So as a parent, if you have a child who's in the preteen years, 7, 8, 9 years old, 6 years old, begin by educating them about the brain. Mm-hmm. And then as they get older, introduce how drugs affect the brain. Yeah. That will have an impact, I think.
Yeah. The same way we talk to our kids about what they choose to eat, and helping them understand that if you eat this, it helps your body in this way, and if you ate that, then it might slow you down, will give you that big rush up and drop down, and just kind of common sense things, helping your kids develop a real love for themselves and a respect for themselves, and giving them the information so that they can make choices.
And helping them appreciate what it is to be healthy, mm-hmm. whether it's food that you eat or staying away from drugs that could harm your body. It's helping them appreciate a healthy living style, mm-hmm. and what that means, so that, as you said, Judd, it leads to healthy, good choices.
Yeah, absolutely. Richard, I know that there's so much more in your book, and we want to encourage families to, not only families who think that their kids may be in danger, but if, your kid is 5 years old and sitting down in your lap and reading the picture books, now's the time to pick up a book like The Addicted Child, A Parent's Guide to Adolescent Substance Abuse, so that you have the information and can be proactive.
Absolutely. My goal in writing this book was to help parents become more knowledgeable about this, less paranoid, less afraid, and more confident. My hope is that when they read this book, and it's only about 100 pages because parents are busy, they don't have time to read volumes of information on this. My hope is that when a parent reads this book, they will walk away with the thought that I've got this, I understand this, I feel better prepared. I hope I never have to use it. I hope I'm never in that situation. But if I am, I know what to do. I know what assessments I need to get done. I know what treatment options are there. I feel more confident about this than I did before.
Mm-hmm. And having those conversations early with your kids about caring for the brain, I think that's going to be facilitated having this knowledge.
I think so too, and I think knowledge is power. Mm-hmm. So the more knowledge that we have, the more knowledge we can help our kids have, then the less likelihood they are to venture off into this world of illicit drug use. Yeah,
Richard, where can people go to find out more about you and find out more about The Addicted Child?
I would recommend people go to the book's website, which is www.helptheaddictedchild.com. helptheaddictedchild.com. When they get to that website, they can review endorsements, they can read book reviews, they can read a sample chapter. There's a link that will take them to Amazon where the book is available as a Kindle and as a paperback. And there's also a parent workbook that I put together, which is very brief because so many times we sort of forget that parents are going through a crisis too. It's not just the kid, it's the parent that need help too. So I put together this short little parent workbook that allows them to have exercises where they can get what they're feeling and what they're going through out on paper. One example is an exercise has you write a letter to your child. You don't have to share that letter with them, but it's a way in which the parent can get their feelings and their emotions out on paper. I wrote the workbook because I recognize that parents need help too.
Great, great. Well, we thank you for writing the book, and we want to encourage everybody to check it out. It's called The Addicted Child, A Parent's Guide to Adolescent Substance Abuse, and we've been speaking with the author, Richard Capriola. Richard, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Jed. It's been a pleasure to meet with you, and I thank you so much for helping me share this information with everyone who listens to your program.
Please be sure to join us for the next episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast. Really, really fun episode. Our guest will be Jason Sheehan. He is the author of Children of the Flying City. That's the next episode of the podcast. Hey, if you're the author of a fantastic children's book, please do go to readingwithyourkids.com. Click on the author's Click Here button at the top of the page to find out how we can help you tell the world about your fantastic children's book. You know, there are thousands of books published every single... You thought I was going to say year. There are thousands of books published every single month. It is really hard to stand out amongst that crowd of books. We would love to help you. By going to readingwithyourkids.com and clicking that author's Click Here button at the top of the page, you can find out how you can be a guest here on the podcast, find out about our Certified Great Read program, and find out how we can celebrate your book with a package of podcast commercials, shout-outs to our 75,000 social media followers, and have your book displayed on our nationwide network of digital pedestrian billboards. Learn all about it by going to readingwithyourkids.com. Want to thank the folks who made today's show so wonderful. Of course, we want to start by thanking our guest, Richard Capriola. Please be sure to check out The Addicted Child, A Parent's Guide to Adolescent Substance Abuse. I also want to thank my team, Fatima Khan, Rory Grady, Skylar Strauss. I want to thank my beautiful wife for all the support she gives me. Most of all, we all want to thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. And as always, thank you so very much for taking the time to make the world a better place by reading with your kids. I'll be looking for you on the next edition of the Reading with Your Kids podcast.